Welcome to Lecture 3 on plant selection. This lecture is part of a series of lectures offered in the subject Agronomy 1 ALM110. This subject is part of the agricultural degree which is offered at the North Melbourne Institute of TAFE. Please visit our website www.nmit.edu.au for any additional information on this subject or any of the other subjects that we offer. My name is Dr. Nikki Cooley. In Lecture 2 of this subject, we learnt about the impacts of the Australian climate on cropping. In this lecture, we are going to explore the input of plant selection. That is, what crop do you grow? How, as a commercial farmer, do you make that decision? What variety do you select? We will begin by learning about the current composition of crops grown in Australia. That is, the Australian cropping commodities. We will also explore cropping options ranked by family and other inputs of variety selection. You will remember this slide from the previous lecture. It is a summary of all the inputs required for basic plant growth. Plant variety is the second input that we are going to cover. But please remember, while studying and looking at plant selection and variety and cultivar, that all these other inputs are also important and are indeed interactive. Crop industries provide a significant contribution to the national economy, as well as many regional communities in Australia. The grains and oilseed industries, which are subject to some seasonal variation, produce about 35 to 45 million tonnes of grain per annum, from an area of more than 20 million hectares. This gives us an annual gross value of production, known as GVP, of around 9 to 13 billion in Australia. These are facts that you can find from the daf.gov.au website on agricultural food crops. It is important to understand that cropping is a commodity. In this section, we are going to look at the value of a crop, the quality of a crop grown, and its relationship with commodity. The continent, Australia, does not have what you might call an ideal climate for cropping. Australia is located in the southern hemisphere, and due to the significant climate variations, which we learnt about in Lecture 2, and typically low quality soils, which we will learn about later on in this subject, high productivity, as measured by tonnes per hectare, are often not obtained. However, Australia does have a very large land mass. It also uses mechanical farming technologies and has highly educated and informed farmers, all of which allow farming through economics of scale. That is, a large area of land, even with low productivities, can still produce large crops. Australia has been developed specific management adaptations to reduce the negative impacts of the climate variation and of the soil. The statistics I am going to present to you in the following slides are all from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Balance of Payments, and Australia, catalogue numbers 5302 and 5303. The Australian cereal grain and products exports is worth 9,570 million in 2012. Grains and oilseed index 156.5, other crops index 119.7, with a total index of 140.2. The calculation of weight index is changed weight basis using the Fisher's Ideal Index. The major contributions of gross value production are cotton, with a contribution of 2 billion Australian dollars, and sugar with a contribution of 1 billion Australian dollars. That's a lot of money. There are several methods of assessing the value of a crop to a country. One such method is looking at the amount of money that country makes from its agricultural exports. This is called the value of Australian agricultural exports. When we look at agronomy from the ABS perspective, it is separated into two major categories: farm grains and oilseeds and farm industrial crops. From the farms, grains and oilseeds, this is subcategorized again into winter crops and summer crops. If we look at this in some detail, you will see that the largest grossing export crop is wheat. This is followed by barley and canola, then chickpeas, peas, lupins, and finally oats. The highest value of export summer crop is rice, of which you may find surprising considering the amount of water that Australia has. This is followed by sorghum grain, cottonseed, corn, and other oilseeds. Other industrial crops are also quoted. These include raw sugar, wine, and sugar. Another way that you can assess the value of Australian cropping is to calculate the indices of prices that are received by farmers. This index is calculated and based on annual gross unit value of production. The higher the index, the higher the value. Therefore, on this ranking produced by the ABS, fruit has the highest received prices, followed by vegetables. You will note that the highest received grain is oats and not wheat. Another way you can assess the worth of Australian agronomy is to look at the distribution of area base. That is, how much land is being cropped. The ABS have categorized the crops into wheat and other crops. In 2011-2012, there was a total of 14 million hectares farmed of wheat across Australia. The other crops, barley, canola, chickpeas, field peas, lupins, oats, triticale, maize, rice, sorghum, soybeans, sunflower seed, linseed, safflower seed, sugarcane and wine grapes, totaled 10.7 million hectares. The total area of farms in Australia is 409.7 million hectares. Australia has a climate that permits both winter and summer cropping. The table on the slide gives you the data for the cropping area and cropping production. This information tells you a lot about winter and summer crops. As an exercise, I'd like you to make 3 statements about this table. Please bring these statements with you to the next class and we will discuss them. Now we have an idea about Australia as a country. Let us look at the various states across Australia and see how their cropping breaks down. The table on the slide is from the ABARE 2011-2012 data. It shows winter and summer area and production cropping for both New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and finally Tasmania. From this data you are able to answer 3 questions. Which state grows the largest winter crop? Which state grows the largest summer crop? And does cropping distribution reflect climate input distributions? Again, please bring the answer of these questions along to the next class. If we were a farmer and to put an ideal wish list together about how we might go about selecting crops and what information we may require, we may come up with the following. We need to have an idea about the commodity value. Some of the statistics that you have been shown in this lecture will give you some idea, although you should note there is a fair degree of forecasting involved in this decision. We also need to look at the growth suitability. Can that crop grow ideally in my climate on my soils? The climate inputs, as we learnt in lecture 2, are very important, and any practice that enables us to grow below optimal will reduce our economic output. We also need to consider the soil. This is things like the pH, texture and structure, and we will talk about these in lectures that follow, and pests and disease suitability. Farm infrastructure is also another important component in choosing a crop. And finally, the market. That is, the pathway and confidence of selling. The variety selection, once you have chosen your species, tends to be geared around the optimal climate, soil type, and disease susceptibility. So let us have a look in detail about some of the crops that are grown around Australia. We will look at these crops according to some simple classification. The first group we will deal with are the cereals. These will include wheat, barley, oats, rye, rice, triticale and maize. On this slide I have listed the family that all of these belong to. You will also note that these are a type of plant called monocot. I'd like you to take a few minutes to look at the picture of each image and see if you can notice differences between these crops. Some of these crops we will be growing at the Yang Ying Teaching and Research Demonstrator, and you will have hands-on experience this semester of learning to identify these crops and assess certain characteristics about these crops. The second classification of crops I'd like to look at are the oil seeds. These include canola, linseed, sunflower, safflower, liona, and palm oil. You will notice that these come from mixed family groups, and they tend to be a subgroup of the dicots. Again, take some time to look at each of these images, which will help with your identification. Some of these crops you will see at the Yang Ying Teaching and Research Demonstrator. The next group of crops are the legumes or pulses. These include peas, faba beans, chickpeas, lupins and lentils. These groups come from a mixed family, and they are a mixture of dicotyledons and eurodicots. Again, spend some time looking at the images. The final crops I want to introduce to you are not under any specific category. This is cotton and sugar. I am introducing these to you because they are very common and high value crops grown in Australia. The group of plants that I have shown you is just a snapshot of the main crops. Of course, there are many other crops grown in Australia, usually on a smaller scale than the crops that have been presented. When you have selected your plant variety, there are some considerations that you need to spend some time thinking about. What traits are economically important in your crop? Is it yield of a vegetative growth or yield of seed production? Are there quality payments? That is, are you paid on the drying of seed, or the payment is the payment on protein content? The management of the crop, is it uniform or maturity that you need to manage to, and do you require any specialised equipment? How do you match your commodity inputs with your physiological inputs? So what is variety selection and crop physiological considerations? Well, they are issues such as how does your variety respond to the local climate? How does your variety interact with temperature? Is it heat resistant or is it frost resistance? What about water and rain? Is it drought resistant? Are you growing in an area that is likely to incur a drought? How does your crop respond to wind? Are you growing in an area that is very open and subjected to high winds? If so, perhaps you should look at a crop that has a short internode length, and this reduces lodging. Lodging is when a crop falls or grain crop falls over, and lodging resistance is the ability for a plant not to be susceptible to lodging. You also want to consider soil characteristics such as pH, salinity, water holding capacity, and soil structure. Shatter is another consideration, and this is the loss of a seed from ahead of a grain crop before you are able to harvest it. Therefore, selecting a crop that is shatter resistant could be very advantageous. Another characteristic is the dry down rate of grain. This allows earlier cropping. We have mentioned disease and pest resistant characteristics, and in future lectures we will be examining this in more detail. You need to also consider seed availability. Can you actually source your crop and source it easily and at a good price? And finally, there are some crop specific trait considerations. What we mean by crop specific trait considerations is there something that you have to consider only for that type of crop? For example, in alfalfa, leafedness is a very desirable trait. It is also desirable in corn and some perennial grasses. The relationship defined by increased leaf results in increased feeding value. Therefore, stems are not worth as much as leaves. You are actually managing carbohydrate partitioning when you are cropping these species. Other examples include grain quality attributes. For example, if you are growing barley, you are probably growing it for the beer industry. Barley has been bred to improve its malting characteristics which influence beer quality, and these are considerations. Another trait-specific considerations is the selection of wheat. Grain has been bred over many years to influence bread making and enable high gluten and starch content, which results in a high quality grain. I have given an overview of some of the important inputs when choosing the crop you're going to grow and the variety that you will choose. Every crop, regional climate, soil and environment is different. So therefore you have to tailor the information to your farm. I have presented a list of sources that you may find very useful for doing this. These include government regional agencies such as the DPI, and they provide fact sheets and information, often about growing a specific crop in that state. There is a wealth of knowledge in the farming community. I strongly advise you to talk to local farmers about regional characteristics. If you are unable to talk to your neighbours directly, you can seek guidance from the Australian Society of Agronomy or go and visit the many industry field days that this industry presents each year. There is a wealth of information on agronomy textbooks and journal articles. Funding R&D agencies such as the Grains Research and Development are a fantastic source of information. Not only do they educate you about the up-to-date research that's being conducted via their funding, but they also continue to produce up-to-date fact sheets on certain crops in certain Australian conditions. And finally, you can always pay for advice. There are a wealth of consultancies in Australia that will help you, and some will offer fee for service. It is worth noting that when you are offered free consultancy, usually by individual companies, you have to be mindful that they are selling a product and that the information that they are giving may not be impartial. The tutorial that supports this lecture is one on a tutorial called Wheat Varieties. It is based on the guide from the Wheat Varieties Department of Environmental and Primary Industries. You will see this source on Moodle as well as the instructions for the tutorial. Please insert the tutorial notes into this part of the lecture so that you can complete your lecture content for this subject. So this brings me to a close of Lecture 3. In summary, we have covered the following topics. What is agronomy in Australia? We have looked at a combination of statistics on commodities from the ABS, based both on an economic worth, a land mass area coverage, and a production base. We have looked at the considerations of plant selection, of which there are 6. Commodities, climate, environment, management inputs, physiological adaptations, pests and diseases. You will note that we have looked at Lecture 2, climate interactions in some consideration, but we will go into further depth about management inputs and physiological adaptations and pests and diseases in further lectures. Please ensure that you add the tutorial notes and complete the questions required from this lecture. This brings us to the end of Lecture 3.